Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening when Peppa and George were getting ready for bed. Mummy Pig had just finished reading them their favorite bedtime story, and Daddy Pig was downstairs watching television. The house felt warm and cozy, with the familiar yellow walls glowing softly in the lamplight. Everything seemed normal, just like any other night in the Pig family home. But as soon as the lights went out, something changed. Peppa noticed that her bedroom felt different somehow. The shadows on the walls seemed to move and shift, even though there was no wind. George's breathing sounded strange from his bed across the room, almost like he was whispering something in his sleep. When Peppa tried to listen more carefully, she realized the whispers weren't coming from George at all. The whispers were coming from inside the walls themselves. They started as a soft murmur, barely audible, but gradually grew louder and more distinct. The voices seemed to be calling her name over and over again, in a sing-song melody that made her skin crawl. Peppa pulled her blanket over her head, but the voices only grew stronger, seeping through the fabric like cold air. Suddenly, George sat up in his bed. But when he turned to look at Peppa, his eyes were completely black, like two empty holes in his face. His usual cheerful smile had been replaced by something much wider and more unsettling. When he spoke, his voice sounded wrong, deeper and echoing as if it was coming from somewhere far away. He told Peppa that the house wanted to play a special game with them tonight. The bedroom door creaked open by itself, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The familiar family photos on the walls had changed. In each picture, the faces of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were twisted into expressions of terror, their eyes following Peppa as she moved. The floorboards groaned under invisible footsteps, and the temperature in the house began to drop rapidly. George stood up and walked toward the door with jerky, unnatural movements, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He beckoned for Peppa to follow him downstairs. As they descended the staircase, each step echoed through the house with a hollow, metallic sound. The living room below was bathed in an eerie blue light that seemed to come from nowhere. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were sitting on the sofa, but they weren't moving. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with those same black, empty eyes. When Peppa called out to them, they turned their heads in perfect unison, their necks making a horrible cracking sound. Their smiles were too wide, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. The television was on, but instead of showing Daddy Pig's usual programs, it displayed images of the house itself, as if cameras were hidden in every room. Peppa could see herself and George on the screen, standing in the living room, but there were other figures in the background that weren't really there. Dark shapes that moved just at the edge of vision. The house began to change around them. The walls started to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. The furniture rearranged itself when no one was looking, and the windows showed not the familiar garden outside, but an endless black void. The family photos continued to change, showing scenes that had never happened, moments of fear and confusion that felt more real than memory. As the night wore on, Peppa realized that this wasn't just a bad dream. The house had become something else entirely, something that fed on the warmth and happiness of the family that lived within it. And now, it wanted to keep them forever, trapped in this twisted version of their home where nothing was quite as it should be, and morning would never come again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The school bell rang as usual that Tuesday morning, but something felt different when Peppa arrived at the playgroup. The building looked exactly the same from the outside, with its bright yellow walls and cheerful red roof. But there was an unusual silence hanging in the air. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Peppa walked through the familiar blue doors and into the classroom where Madame Gazelle usually greeted everyone with her warm smile. But today, Madame Gazelle was standing perfectly still at the front of the class, facing the blackboard. Her back was turned to the children, and she hadn't moved or spoken since Peppa entered. One by one, Peppa's friends began to arrive. Susie Sheep bounced in as energetic as ever, followed by Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others. But as each child took their seat, they too became perfectly still and quiet. They sat with their hands folded neatly on their desks, staring straight ahead with expressions that seemed somehow empty. Peppa tried to talk to Susie, her best friend, but Susie didn't respond. She just continued staring forward with a blank smile that never changed. When Peppa waved her hand in front of Susie's face, there was no reaction at all. It was as if Susie couldn't see or hear her anymore. The classroom felt colder than usual, and Peppa noticed that the colorful drawings that normally decorated the walls had changed. The happy pictures of families and sunny days had been replaced by strange, dark sketches that seemed to move slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. The alphabet letters above the blackboard appeared to be rearranging themselves into words she couldn't quite read. Madame Gazelle finally turned around, but her usual kind expression had been replaced by something mechanical and distant. Her eyes seemed to look right through Peppa as if she wasn't there at all. When she spoke, her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, echoing strangely in the small classroom. She began the day's lesson, but instead of teaching about numbers or letters, she started talking about a special game that all the children would play. It was a game about staying perfectly still and quiet forever, about never moving or speaking again. The other children nodded in unison, their movements synchronized like clockwork dolls. Peppa felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was the only one who seemed to remember how things used to be. She tried to stand up and leave, but found that her chair seemed to be holding her in place. The more she struggled, the heavier her body felt, as if invisible weights were being attached to her arms and legs. The windows of the classroom began to darken, even though it was still morning outside. The cheerful yellow walls started to fade to a sickly gray color, and the temperature continued to drop. Peppa could see her breath forming small clouds in the increasingly cold air. Madame Gazelle continued her lesson about the special game, explaining that once you learned to play it properly, you would never want to play anything else ever again. She said it was the most important lesson any child could learn, and that soon Peppa would understand why all her friends had chosen to play it. The other children began to turn their heads toward Peppa in perfect unison, their movements slow and deliberate. Their faces still wore those same empty smiles, but their eyes had become completely white, with no pupils or color remaining. They all spoke at the same time, their voices blending into one eerie chorus, inviting Peppa to join their special game. Peppa tried to call out for help, but her voice seemed to be getting weaker and weaker. The classroom felt like it was getting bigger and bigger, with the walls stretching away from her until her friends looked like tiny figures in the distance. Yet somehow, their white eyes remained clearly visible, always watching her. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking, its hands frozen at exactly 12 o'clock. But Peppa couldn't tell if it was noon or midnight anymore, because the darkness outside the windows had become complete. There were no streetlights, no cars, no signs of life anywhere beyond the classroom walls. Madame Gazelle approached Peppa's desk with that same mechanical smile, carrying a piece of chalk that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. She began writing something on Peppa's desk, symbols and letters that hurt to look at directly. As she wrote, Peppa felt her own thoughts becoming quieter and more distant. The special game was beginning to make sense now. It was about letting go of everything that made you who you were, about becoming part of something larger and more peaceful. Peppa's friends had already learned this lesson, and now they were waiting patiently for her to join them in their eternal stillness. As the chalk finished writing on her desk, Peppa felt her body beginning to relax. The struggle to move and speak was becoming less important. The cold air felt comfortable now, and the silence seemed welcoming rather than frightening. Her friend's white eyes no longer looked scary, but rather like beacons guiding her toward understanding. In the final moments before the lesson was complete, Peppa realized that this wasn't really a classroom anymore, and these weren't really her friends. But somehow that didn't matter. What mattered was that soon she would be just like them, perfectly still and perfectly quiet, playing the special game that never ends. The last thing Peppa remembered was the sound of chalk writing her name on the blackboard, adding it to a long list of other names that had been written there before. And then, like all the others, she learned to sit perfectly still and smile that same empty smile, waiting for the next child to arrive and learn about the special game that everyone must eventually play. scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their bedroom. The toys they had left scattered on the floor were now arranged in a perfect circle, all facing the center where their favorite teddy bear sat motionless. Peppa thought it was odd, but George just giggled and ran to play with his dinosaur. That night, as the family slept peacefully, the toys began to move on their own. The teddy bear's button eyes started glowing with an eerie red light, and it slowly turned its head toward the sleeping children. One by one, the other toys joined in, creating a silent parade around the room. The toy car rolled without being pushed, and the wooden blocks spelled out words that no child should ever read. When morning came, Peppa woke up to find all her toys staring directly at her bed. Their usual cheerful expressions had changed into something much more sinister. The teddy bear's smile had become a twisted grin, showing tiny sharp teeth that definitely weren't there before. George's dinosaur toy had grown real claws, and its plastic eyes had turned completely black. Peppa tried to tell Mummy and Daddy Pig about the strange behavior of their toys, but every time she spoke, the toys would return to their normal positions. Her parents thought she was just having bad dreams. But Peppa knew something was terribly wrong when she noticed that the toys were following her with their eyes wherever she went in the house. During breakfast, the family sat around their usual table in the bright yellow kitchen. Everything seemed normal until Peppa looked down at her plate and saw that her food had arranged itself into the same circle pattern as the toys. George started crying when his juice box began pouring itself, creating strange symbols on the table. The house began to change around them. The cheerful yellow walls started to fade to a sickly green color, and the windows showed not the sunny garden outside, but a dark forest filled with twisted trees and glowing eyes. The family portraits on the walls began to move, showing the pig family with increasingly frightened expressions. As the day progressed, more toys from around the house joined the strange gathering. Old dolls with cracked faces and stuffed animals with patches of fur missing all assembled in the growing circle. The toys began to whisper among themselves in voices too quiet for human ears, but Peppa could somehow understand every word. That evening, the toys made their final move. They surrounded the entire family in the living room, their eyes glowing brighter than ever before. The teddy bear stepped forward and spoke in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves, explaining that they needed the family's help to return to the world of the living. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, Peppa remembered something her grandmother had told her about the power of love and imagination. She closed her eyes tightly and began to think of all the happy times she had shared with her toys, all the adventures they had been on together. Slowly, the toys began to remember too. Their angry expressions softened as they recalled the gentle hands that had played with them and the comfort they had provided during scary nights. The red glow in their eyes faded, replaced by the warm light of cherished memories, and everything returned to normal. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window, and everything appeared normal. Peppa stretched and yawned, looking over at George, who was still sleeping peacefully in the bottom bunk. But something felt different today. As Peppa climbed down from her bed, she noticed that her reflection in the bedroom mirror seemed to move just a fraction of a second after she did. She stopped and stared at the mirror, but her reflection appeared perfectly normal now. George stirred and opened his eyes, but when he looked at Peppa, his usual cheerful expression was replaced by something else entirely. George's eyes had changed. They were still the same size and shape, but they seemed darker somehow, as if shadows had crept into them during the night. When he smiled at Peppa, his grin stretched just a little too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Her back was turned to the children as they entered, and she was humming a tune that Peppa had never heard before. The melody was strange and unsettling. When Mummy Pig turned around, her smile was as warm as always, but her eyes had the same dark quality that Peppa had noticed in George. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper at the breakfast table, but the pages were completely blank. He turned each empty page with great interest, occasionally chuckling at invisible jokes. When Peppa pointed this out, Daddy Pig looked at her with confusion and insisted that he was reading the most fascinating article. The house itself began to feel different as the morning progressed. Rooms seemed to be in slightly different places than they were the day before. The hallway appeared longer, and doors that Peppa was certain led to familiar rooms now opened onto spaces she had never seen before. One door revealed a room filled entirely with mirrors, each one showing a slightly different version of whoever looked into them. By afternoon, more friends had arrived to play, but they too had changed. Susie Sheepswool had turned a shade of gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The playground where they usually played had transformed overnight. The swings moved by themselves in the still air, creaking with a rhythm that sounded almost like whispered words. As evening approached, the changes became more pronounced. The sun set in the wrong direction, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. The familiar yellow house on the hill had developed extra windows that glowed with an inner light. When bedtime arrived, Peppa and George climbed into their beds as usual, but sleep would not come easily. The house creaked and settled around them, but the sounds were different now, more deliberate. The last thing Peppa remembered before finally drifting off to sleep was the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their room. These weren't the familiar footsteps of Mummy or Daddy Pig. These steps were lighter, more numerous, as if many small feet were walking back and forth throughout the night.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday when Peppa discovered the old music box in Grandpa Pig's attic. The tiny ballerina inside spun slowly to a melody that seemed strangely familiar, yet wrong somehow. When Peppa wound it up, the tune played backwards, and the ballerina's painted smile looked more like a grimace. That night, Peppa heard the music box playing by itself downstairs. She crept down to find it sitting on the kitchen table, though she was certain she had left it in her room. The ballerina was spinning faster now, and with each turn, the house seemed to change slightly. The family photos on the walls showed different faces, still the pig family, but their expressions were cold and distant. George woke up crying, but when Peppa went to comfort him, she found his room completely empty. Not just George was gone, his bed, his toys, even the wallpaper had changed to a pattern she didn't recognize. When she called for Mummy and Daddy, their voices answered from somewhere far away, as if they were calling from the bottom of a deep well. The music box melody grew louder, echoing through the house from every room at once. Peppa followed the sound, but each door she opened led to a room that shouldn't exist. A library filled with books that had no words, just blank pages that rustled like whispers. A dining room where the table was set for a family of shadows. The other Peppa in the mirror began to move independently, pressing her hands against the glass from the inside. She mouthed words that Peppa couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "Let me out, and I'll let you in." The music box tune reached a crescendo, and suddenly every mirror in the house showed the same scene. Dozens of other Peppas, all pressing against the glass, all wanting to trade places. Peppa realized that the music box wasn't just playing a tune. It was playing with reality itself. Each note rearranged something in the house, something in her world. The ballerina wasn't dancing. She was conducting an orchestra of impossibilities. And with each spin, the barrier between Peppa's world and the mirror world grew thinner. When morning came, Mummy Pig found Peppa standing in front of the hallway mirror, perfectly still. She was smiling, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The music box sat silent on the table, its ballerina frozen mid-spin. And if you looked very carefully at any mirror in the house, you might catch a glimpse of another little pig, pressing her hands against the glass, trying desperately to get back home,